Hey everybody, this is Dan from Mechanical Malarkey. Today I want to talk about lug nut torque. One of my pet peeves is professional mechanics who don't torque lug nuts correctly. Now just about every nut, bolt, and screw on a car will have some sort of torque spec from the engineers telling you how tight you're supposed to tighten them. Most of those don't really matter. The ones I only care about are things like head bolts, connecting rods, bearing caps, axle nuts, and lug nuts. Most other things, just get them tight. You can tell when something's tight. You know how not to over tighten once you've done this a while. Lug nuts, far too often I see professional mechanics ramming them on with just their impact gun and calling that good. Problem is, a lot of times, most times, that is way too tight. The torque specs on passenger cars, it's often 80 on a car like this Civic. Sometimes it's 100 on a minivan or 150 on a pickup truck. Most impact wrenches that mechanics use put out hundreds of pound-feet of torque. This one is a pretty cheap one that only puts out 250, but even that is way more than this should have. So I shouldn't be just putting them on, just holding the trigger on this until they stop. What you're supposed to do is one of a couple different things. Either put them on until they're snug, then use a torque wrench to tighten them to the proper torque, or with your impact wrench, use a torque stick, which is a special torque limiting adapter. They make these both as just a plain extension where you put a socket on, or they make ones with a built-in socket, and then use that, and it will limit how much torque is actually applied to the lug nut. Torque sticks come in a variety of ratings. I have an 80 and a 100 of the extension type. And then for the socket ones, I have 80 pounds for 19 and 21 millimeter and 100 pounds for 22 millimeter. Because those are what I most often need. If you want to be really sure about your torque specs being right, you can use a torque stick and then use a torque wrench once the car is on the ground to make sure. So if you leave the lug nuts too loose, they can eventually work their way off and then the wheel comes off, and that's a really bad thing. But if you over tighten them, when you or the customer, whoever owns the car, has a flat tire, they're trying to get the lug nuts off and they can't budge them with the little 8-inch wrench that comes with the car, that's a problem. Also, when you over torque them, you will stress the studs, and over time that could lead them to weaken, maybe eventually fail on their own, or if you just keep on there with your impact wrench, you can just snap them right off yourself. It does take several seconds to do that, but I see a lot of mechanics just hammering on there for a few seconds on every single lug nut with no torque stick, and that's definitely over tightening them. A lot of times I can tell by the feel when I'm taking them off with my impact wrench if it's a little too tight, if the person before me tightened them without doing proper torque spec procedures. But then recently, when my snap-on impact wrench broke, I ended up buying temporarily a Walmart brand Hyper Tough impact wrench, which is only rated at 250 pound-feet, and the number of cars that I had trouble getting lug nuts off of was ridiculous. Way too many cars were getting over-tightened to where I was having trouble getting them off. If I had a stronger gun, sure, no problem, but then again, side of the road, flat tire, can't get them off. One time at the first dealership I worked at, the express team somehow broke a stud on a car with only like 5,000 miles on it. The service writer they had was blaming them and their use of torque sticks for that stud breaking, which we all knew was ridiculous because you're not going to break a stud using an 80-pound torque stick. To prove that, I got an old hub, stuck a nut on it, and just sat there with my impact wrench with a torque stick, just holding the trigger, and it was not breaking. I then took the torque stick out, put the socket on, in like 10 seconds, rips the stud right in half. So if you're using these, you're not going to over tighten them. Obviously, it is possible you could under tighten with a torque stick if you don't actually run it to its full strength, but with most impact wrenches, they make way more power than what your rating is, so that should be no problem. If the wheels come off when you use the torque stick and you torqued it all properly, it's not the torque stick's fault. Almost every time at work, when I have trouble getting lug nuts off, I can look at the service history and I can usually guess pretty accurately what the last technician to work on it was because I know they don't torque things right. The other problem with not properly torquing things is that, say this lug nut gets 150 pound-feet of torque, this one gets 120, this gets 100, this gets 200. It's all over the place how tight they are, and that can cause problems like warped rotors or stress parts in other ways. The one other thing I see people doing wrong is just going around in a circle. You're supposed to tighten in a star pattern to make sure it all gets evenly tightened on, not just in a circle. So when you're putting a wheel on, either use a torque stick, use a torque wrench, or use both. Don't just ram it on with your impact wrench. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Follow me on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and read the blog at mechanicalmalarkey.com. Thanks for watching.